Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me today. My name is Lauren Barrett. I'm a winemaking specialist with Enartis, and today we're going to be talking about driving Chardonnay wine style. Just a few webinar housekeeping points before we get started with the webinar. This is being recorded and it will be published on our website. And we ask that you please refrain from using the chat box during the presentation. There will be 15 minutes for questions at the end of the presentations. And you guys can also toggle the chat box closed if it's too distracting during the presentation at least. So today we're really going to be starting with Chardonnay history and current relevance, and then going through some of the various vinification and processing strategies with Chardonnay, and really focusing on Chardonnay aroma and wine style and how to manipulate that with Chardonnay yeast selection, the application of malolactic fermentation, and then finishing with some more in-depth winemaking protocols. Chardonnay can trace its roots back to Burgundy in France, likely from the small village of Mâcon in the Mâconnais region of France. I have it highlighted here just in the southern tip, which you can see on the right. And the earliest records there of the reference of the name Chardonnay were actually from the 1300s in a monastery in that village. And the name Chardonnay itself is believed to be from the medieval Latin word cardum nacum, which means a place of thistles. Some of the most famous wines from Burgundy are from the Golden Triangle, and this is a triangle which connects Meursault, Poligny-Montrachet, and Chassagne-Montrachet, and the top estates from these regions are really famous for producing what some would claim to be some of the best white wines in the world. Within Burgundy, the white variety that is grown is Chardonnay. I should have mentioned that earlier. But the thing about great white Burgundies, they're really distinguished by their amazing aging potential and this really beautiful, complex reduction bouquet that develops through barrel aging and then also through bottle aging. Typically, the Chardonnays are barrel fermented in new French oak barrels and then aged on fine lees for quite some time. Barrel aging of white wine ranges with each variety, but usually it's between 2 to 6 months, let's say in the New World, and Chardonnay is typically aged anywhere from from 12 to 15 months in France. And again, you can see some of the chemistry here of what would be expected from the region: a lower alcohol percentage, around 13%, total acidity ranging from 6 to 7 grams per liter, and the pH from 3.1 to 3.3. And these specific parameters, along with this reductive aging in barrel for quite some time, is what really lends it to these beautiful wines with great aging potential. And again, that really nice gunflint noble reduction bouquet that develops. Now, although Chardonnay can trace its roots back to Burgundy, the rise in popularity of the variety throughout the world and it being one of the most successfully sold grape varieties throughout the world is due to the efforts of viticulturists and winemakers here in the New World in California. Now, the first reference of Chardonnay being grown in the state was actually in the late 1800s. At that time, there was typically a lot of confusion with Chardonnay and Pinot Blanc and Melon de Bourgogne. But through the efforts of Charles Wetmore in the late 1800s, he was the California viticulture commissioner, and he actually really advocated for trying to diversify budwood and plant material for various nurseries and wineries throughout California. And he brought over some budwood from Meursault in Burgundy, and this is really an integral part of what is one of the most world-renowned clonal varieties for Chardonnay, which is the Wente clone, or historical clones, I should say, within at least the state of California. And the major source of California Chardonnay in general is from this from Wente Vineyard in Livermore, and then also from the Paul Masson Vineyard in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And Today, there are now over 100 different Chardonnay clones listed in Foundation Plant Service Directory through University of California, Davis. And there is a lot of really rich history and efforts that took place by various researchers for specific clonal selection and trying to mitigate some of the hens and chicks and chatter that we can see with Chardonnay as a variety. And when we're talking about California Chardonnay and its rise to popularity throughout the world, there really was one main event which brought Chardonnay to the front stage, and this was organized by Stephen Spurrier, who was a wine buyer he's from England, and he actually organized the 1976 Judgment of Paris tasting, where basically California Chardonnays and Burgundian Chardonnays were tasted blind, and surprisingly California completely swept the rankings, and we had Chateau Montelena in first place, and third place for Chardonnay we had Chalone Vineyard and Spring Mountain Vineyard, and then also Freemark Abbey. So it really shook the wine world and brought to center stage Chardonnay and Cabernet Sauvignon as a grape variety, and showed the world how serious California was about winemaking and how it could stand up to the history of French winemaking. Chardonnay, I should mention, I have a picture of Pinot Blanc and Gouais Blanc, and those are both of the parents of Chardonnay. So it's a cross between Pinot Blanc and Gouais Blanc. So for more history on California Chardonnay, I really recommend checking out this article from Jancis Robinson. It's a 4-part article, and it goes into much more detail about the development of different styles within California and the producers that were really heading the movement for California Chardonnay, and that's listed in the citations. So now I'm going to be getting into some of the vinification and processing strategies for Chardonnay. With Chardonnay and any white wine variety, it's really important to prevent oxidation and any sort of microbial spoilage, especially during harvest and transport to a winery. So once there's any sort of liquid, it's at this stage that we need to try to use all the tools available to us to mitigate the detrimental effects of oxidation. And that is by keeping temperatures low and then also using various antioxidant protection, such as sulfur dioxide, and there's also various enological tannins which can be applied to help mitigate the detrimental effects of oxygen. Now, oxygen can actually react with various phenols, and it goes through either a chemical or enzymatic browning, which will cause a loss of color, and phenolic compounds can oxidize various fatty acids and lipids to form bitter and vegetable characteristics in wine. And then we can see the degradation of thiols and various aromatic compounds which lead to a loss of varietal aroma. So it's very important to protect against oxygen, especially during the beginning stages. Later on, we'll start to talk about more passive oxidation with barrel ferments, but in general, it should be well protected, especially in transport to the winery. Now, once we receive the grapes, we have two different options for processing, and that could be either through whole cluster or crushed grapes pressing. Whole cluster presents some advantages in that it creates some stem channels which facilitate easier juicing, and it also helps limit the extraction of phenols. And some of the disadvantages are just the lower capacity with the inclusion of the stems. In comparison to crushed grapes, which you can actually apply various enological enzymes, and this will help release some bound glycosylated precursors in the skins and help increase aromatic potential. Chardonnay is actually considered to be a pretty neutral variety, so this is definitely a massive tool for driving specific style, which we'll get into later in the presentation. Some of the disadvantages with crushed grapes is that there is an increased risk for the extraction of phenols. There's typically longer press cycles, and sometimes you'll have to use various press aids just to facilitate easier pressing. So here we have extracting, settling, and clarification. So with skin contact, if we do have crushed grapes, that can typically be between 6 to 24-hour skin contact. Chardonnay can actually have prolonged skin contact compared to other varieties, and this would be the point in the winemaking process where we could use a glucosidase enzyme to help liberate some bound glycoconjugate aroma precursors. When we're doing skin contact, it's also important to limit any sort of flavonoid, phenolic extraction by lowering the temperature. When pressing the wines, whether it be whole cluster or with crushed fruit, it's really important to use low pressures. And this is to limit suspended solids and also the dissolution of phenolic compounds. One tool that's available to us now is voltammetry, which is extremely useful for benchmarking press factions. NomoSense Polyscan is a great tool, and if any of you have any questions about voltammetry, I'd be happy to talk in more detail. You can just reach out to me, but this is a great tool for benchmarking. And after pressing, we head to settling, which usually can either be performed statically in a tank, or you can also use flotation technologies as well. And this would be the point where we'd be looking at applying a pectolytic enzyme to facilitate faster settling and clarification. We can also explore different phenolic fining, either with PVPP or PVI-PVP. And the target here is really 200 NTU, as if we have too high of a turbid environment, yeast tend to produce much more higher concentrations of H2S and volatile sulfur compounds. With Chardonnay, there's really two different schools of thought for winemaking. There is either limiting oxygen, which is taking a reductive winemaking strategy, preserving varietal aroma, and then there's passive oxidation or even juice browning, which I'll talk in more detail about in the barrel fermentation section of this presentation. On the right here, I have two products listed which actually contain PVI-PVP, and they also contain some yeast polysaccharides. And these are great tools for removing basically catalysts of oxidation, which are metals, and then also smaller phenolic units, which can contribute to bitterness as well. So removing this in the beginning and the earliest stages on during the fermentation are going to help increase your aging potential. And also it will help enhance primary aromas and provide from some enhanced mouthfeel as well. So that's Enartis Pro XP and Enartis Pro FT. So now we're going to be getting into Chardonnay aroma and wine style. Now, it's really important for us as winemakers to have a better understanding of the odorants and the contribution of non-volatile grape precursors and what tools we have to help reveal these non-volatile precursors in finished wine and ultimately drive specific wine style. So Chardonnay varietal aroma, even though it's considered to be a fairly neutral variety, it does contain some non-volatile varietal precursors. And so that includes glycosylated precursors, which means that there are various terpenic and C13 norisoprenoid compounds, which are bound to sugar molecules. And then we also have some cysteine and glutathione linked precursors, which belong to the family of thiols. Now with terpenes and C13 norisoprenoids, beta-glucosidase activity, which is an enzyme which specific non-Saccharomyces yeast and Saccharomyces cerevisiae and some select lactic acid bacteria express, can help reveal these glycoconjugated precursors and transform them into their volatile form. So in Chardonnay, these are the four main terpenes and norisoprenoids present. Beta-damascenone in Chardonnay kind of lends to more of a lemon balm, honey, and rose aroma. And then we have free oxo-A-enol, which is kind of just described as being more fruity. And TDN, which is also found in aged Rieslings. It's more of a petrol and kerosene aroma. And this then Vitisperine, which is also in that fruity kind of aromatic profile. From the family of thiols, we have 3 SHA and 4 MSP. free SH, and then we also have benzene methanethyl and then 2-furan methanethyl, and these are actually thiols which can only be formed when a wine is aged in wood barrels from an actual furfural, but I'll go into details with that in the next slide. But yeast containing beta lyase activity will help reveal these thiols in finished wine. So when you're thinking about, whether or not you want to have a Chardonnay which has more gunflint thiolic profile, or if you want a Chardonnay that is going to have more terpenic and C13 resveratrol, more rose and fruity aroma, it's really important to look at the enzyme activity of the select yeast strain that you're going to be applying during fermentation. And with that being said, yeast and bacteria, the enzyme activity of yeast and the bacteria really can only reveal about 10% of the actual bound precursors. So we have other tools available to us to help increase volatile varietal aroma, and that includes the addition of exogenous enzymes, and then also the application of specific amino nitrogen for deriving specific style. So now we're talking more about esters and acetates, which are specifically produced from yeast. They're secondary aromas, and they're the second most significant volatile chemical group in Chardonnay. And this includes acetates of higher alcohols and ethyl esters of fatty acids. Now, the concentration of these really depend on yeast strain, the specific enzyme expression, the concentration of unsaturated fatty acids, fermentation temperature, any sort of supplementation with additional carbon sources or chaptalization, and then also the nitrogen source as well. So the main esters of unwooded Chardonnay are listed below, but in general, esters are really described as being more of a fruity aroma. Ethyl hexanate actually has more of a pineapple kind of aroma listed here. But more importantly, esters and acetates play an important role in young wines, but they really rapidly hydrolyze during the first year in bottle and have no long-term influence on the aromatic characteristics of white wine. So if you're producing a wine that's meant to age for quite some time, then you should be considering the ester and acetate production and understand that that's going to dissipate through bottle aging. So here I have a table of some of our recommended yeast strains for Chardonnay and their specific enzyme activity. So like we just discussed with trying to reveal specific thiols or revealing norepinephrinoids or terpenes, which are glycoconjugates, it's important to look at the enzyme activity of the yeast, and this will help really give you more power and more tools for directing wine style. So Aroma White is a Saccharomyces cerevisiae within our range, and it has beta lyase activity, which will help reveal thiols, and also has a high ester production because of this alcohol acetyltransferase enzyme as well. So the main sensory effect is listed here, more tropical and fruit aroma, and then we also have the recommended temperature range depending on what you want to express in the finished wine. ES191 also has the beta lyase activity, and it also has the glucosidase activity, which will help reveal some of those terpenic and norepinephrinoid compounds as well. Here, Vintage White is a great strain. It's really what we recommend for barrel fermentation. It also produces a high amount of polysaccharides, and this specific yeast will reveal terpenes and norepinephrinoids and contribute more of a fruit aroma. And then Q citrus as well has the same sort of glucosidase activity and will produce fruit aroma. I really like the Q citrus as well for elaborating more mineral-driven Chardonnays, and we have here the recommended temperature range depending on what type of characteristic you are hoping to lend to the Chardonnay. And here again is just bullet points going over the specific enzyme activity and how that will increase various odorants in Chardonnay. I hope that you guys reference this, and if you have any other questions as well about the other yeasts in our range and their specific enzyme activity, feel free to reach out to me directly, and I'd be happy to give you that information, because it's very important that we consider this, especially when we are selecting strains. On this slide, we have a table which is listed on the right, which was pulled from a really great review on the aroma of Chardonnay from Gambetta et al. 2014, which is in the citations. And this is a comparison of two different studies looking at the effect of oak-fermented Chardonnay and then tank-fermented Chardonnay, and how that will influence various volatile compounds in these two very different styles of Chardonnay, marked as fruity or oaky. So here we have the two different studies listed on top of the table, and what we can see is that overall, with the influence of oak, there was an increase in higher alcohols, ethyl acetate, and a fourfold increase in total esters compared to the fruity Chardonnay, which was elaborated in stainless steel. And what we have here highlighted is some of the oak volatile compounds which are going to be extracting from barrels. So of course we would expect to see an increase in some of these oak lactone characteristics, eugeniol and vanillin. And another very fascinating reaction that occurs in barrel ferments is a furfural reduction. So furfural is reduced when aged in contact with lees and forms benzene methanethiol and 2-furan methanethiol. And this lends to this very flinty gunpowder roast coffee characteristic found in barrel fermented and aged Chardonnays, which is again has to occur in barrel in order for this furfural reduction to occur. We're going to start talking about some of the various Chardonnay wine styles. In this presentation, I'm just focusing on still Chardonnay wines. In the future, we'll hopefully do another sparkling webinar where we'll get to talk about Chardonnay and its application in sparkling wines. But the three main styles that I wanted to go over today were oak-fermented and aged Chardonnay, and then mineral citrus-driven Chardonnays, and ending with buttery, toasty, creamy Chardonnay and the effects of malolactic fermentation in that specific style. So we'll start with oak-fermented and aged Chardonnay wine style. With oak-fermented and aged Chardonnays, what happens is with the application of barrel fermentation is a passive oxidation. So it's different than some of the more reductive inert protection that we see for reductive winemaking strategies. So within this style, there is no SO2 required prior to fermentation. And you could use various inert gases and nitrogen to control and prevent the oxidation during crushing and pressing. But really the goal with the juice is to actually induce the oxidation of phenols. And in doing so, this will cause them to precipitate and drop out during the settling process. So in a sense, it's the early elimination of these oxidizable compounds that cause browning and loss of fruit aromas at racking, but it's going to prevent any sort of post-bottling premature aging, because you're inducing it in the earlier stages and removing these substrates for browning from the actual must. So here on the right, we actually have a comparison of two different wines, one that just went through a more reductive winemaking strategy, and then one that went through hyperoxidation or passive oxidation. And this is the total phenolic index, and then this is the hydroxycinnamic acids, which are the predominant phenolics in white wine. And what we could see in comparison is that there is a significantly lower total phenolic index and lower hydroxycinnamic acids with the wine that went through this hyperoxidation process and this elimination of these oxidizable compounds in the juice phase. So with oak fermented and aged Chardonnays, the typical vinification process is that the grapes are pressed, juice is settled, and then it's racked directly into barrel without any sulfur. Barrels are then topped off after primary fermentation is complete, and usually there's racking off the gross lees prior to secondary. And then with the fine lees and during secondary, typically batonnage is performed on the wine to help redistribute all of the fine lees and encourage some yeast autolysis and release of manoproteins and polysaccharides into the wine. This continues to happen over the full 12-month period of aging on the lees, and the reducing power of the lees actually really protects the wine from oxidation because lees can absorb a lot of oxygen. Lees can also absorb some various off flavors and aroma and some positive aroma as well. And as yeast go through autolysis and they release some of these constituents of manoproteins and polysaccharides, they're also going to be re-releasing some various enzymes back into solution. So beta-glucosidase enzymes can be re-released, and this can actually help reveal some non-volatile precursors such as monoterpenes and increase some floral and fruity aromas. At the same time, there's esterase enzymes which can be released, which can reduce some of these esters which may have been formed during primary fermentation. So it's important to keep that balance in mind. And another thing as well to balance with barrel-aged wines is the formation of reductive odors. And with any sort of highly reductive environment that protects the wine, there's going to be an increased chance for reductive odor appearance. So it's important to balance that during the barrel aging period. In the US, the barrel aging for Chardonnays is typically only between 2 to 6 months compared to in France, which we discussed earlier, which can be anywhere from that 10 to 16-month period. Now, this autolysis and aging on the lees takes quite a bit of time to really release all of these beneficial constituents like manoproteins and polysaccharides. So we have tools likely available to us to really expedite that. So that includes enological enzymes and various yeast derivatives, which can mimic that same effect as surly aging and really save time and mitigate the risk for negative volatile sulfur aroma formation. And with that, like optimizing surly aging, within our range, we have the surly range, which is composed of inactivated yeast, and it's really meant, surly 1 is meant to complement natural lees in the surly aging phase, and it's a very fast release of manoproteins compared to endogenous lees. So this can happen over a 3 to 4 week period treatment with daily homogenization over, what would have taken, potentially 12 months for natural autolysis to release manoproteins back into solution. Surly élevage is an even more expedited polysaccharide in which the effect can happen in just 24 to 48 hours with daily homogenization. And to help increase the autolysis of yeast cells, there's various beta-glucanase enzymes which can help act on the cellular membrane of yeast cells and expedite the release of these constituents into wine. So that can help with just a 4 to 6 week treatment. And then we also have the Enartis Easy Filter within our range, which is a newer enzyme, which also has pectolytic and some of the same beta-glucanase activity and can have the same effect on wine lees, releasing those desirable manoproteins and polysaccharides into the wine and expediting a wine to market. Next, we're going to be moving on to more of the mineral citrus driven Chardonnay wine styles. So with mineral citrus-driven Chardonnay, there was for quite some time some mystery around what attributed to this mineral character in wine. And researchers were at first looking at various ions in wine, if that could affect the perception of minerality. And more the research is pointing towards volatile sulfur compounds actually being correlated with this perception of minerality, and as well as succinic acid. So methanethyl has been positively correlated with the perception of minerality, along with some ethyl esters, and then increased succinic acid has been correlated with the perception of minerality. So we have some various tools available to us for increasing succinic acid, the first being yeast strain selection. Within our range, top 15 and Q9 are strong succinic acid producers. And then we have some winemaking practices to also increase that. So including higher solids, moderate SO2 addition, fermentation temperatures less than 68 degrees, targeting nitrogen supplementation to at least 300 milligrams per liter of YAN, but really limiting amino nitrogen, organic nitrogen supplementation. And then aeration has also been shown to increase succinic acid as well. So now we're going to be moving more into the buttery, toasty, creamy Chardonnay style. And with that, I'll also be talking more about malolactic fermentation. So with malolactic fermentation, strain selection and diacetyl production are the main drivers of this characteristic of butter, toasty, creamy notes in Chardonnay wines. So homolactic and heterolactic sugar metabolism pathways, as well as the utilization of citric acid, is what increases the concentration of diacetyl, which is the main compound associated with these descriptors. So between 1 to 3 milligrams per liter will lend to more of this nutty flavor and aroma profile, and then 5 to 7 milligrams per liter will bring it more into that buttery toast note. So with wanting to increase mouthfeel and diacetyl, the choice of yeast strain and lower inoculation rate is going to help preserve some of that diacetyl. You're going to want to ferment, have temperatures above 64 degrees during malolactic fermentation, and mitigate the contact with lees, because lees actually has this absorption of effect of diacetyl. You want a semi-aerobic environment, and then if you're using any sort of redox measurements, around 300 millivolts and 2 to 4 milligrams per liter of oxygen will help increase the production of diacetyl as well. And then once the desired level of diacetyl is reached, it's very important to sulfite, as SO2 can react with diacetyl in a reversible manner, releasing it during fermentation and during maturation. And it's also very important to mitigate any sort of yeast metabolism, as yeast can metabolize diacetyl once it's been produced. Unfortunately, I feel like a lot of winemakers overlook secondary fermentation and how important it is for driving specific wine styles, especially for Chardonnay. So not only does malolactic fermentation and specific malolactic bacteria deacidify wine and create a much more biologically stable product, but it's very important for driving specific aroma enhancement and for driving specific styles, like if we wanted to produce higher diacetyl or if we wanted to respect varietal character. I should have mentioned it previously, but citric acid metabolism is what really drives diacetyl. And I would not recommend supplementing with citric acid, as it could really create a risk for accumulation of acetic acid. So just consider that if citric acid has crossed your mind as being a tool for driving diacetyl. I think strain selection and then looking at your initial malic acid level is going to be one of the main drivers to, implementing a buttery style of Chardonnay. But within our range, we have MCW, ML Silver, and ML Uno. If you look at the graph on the left-hand side, we have a comparison of Enartis ML Silver and MCW. Enartis ML Silver here is a really great strain for more of this fruity floral style. It has some of this glycosidase activity, which releases a lot of these terpenic and C13 norisoprenoid compounds, which we spoke on earlier in the presentation. And MCW, listed here, it actually produces a pretty high amount of diacetyl. So it's great for elaborating the specific style of buttery, creamy Chardonnay. And here we can see in comparison between the two strains that Enartis ML-MCW produces about 5.47 milligrams per liter, which is in that same realm of being butter aroma compared to Enartis ML Silver. And then we also have Enartis ML Uno, which is a great strain for really respecting varietal characteristics as well. And winemakers also have the option to only do a percentage of malolactic fermentation if they're looking to preserve some of that sensory perception of malic acid and more freshness. So that is also an option always when elaborating Chardonnay. And some people don't even practice malolactic fermentation for Chardonnays. It just really depends on the growing region and the specific style objective. So depending on the style of Chardonnay, it's really going to impact the application of malolactic fermentation, whether you're not a partial or full malolactic fermentation. But for the styles which are more in the realm of mineral, floral, or varietal-driven Chardonnays, those fermentations are likely going to happen in tank, and they kind of have a pipeline application for what would typically be applied for malolactic fermentation in tank. So during alcoholic, we actually really recommend using a blend of yeast, polysaccharides, and oak products. Our Encanto NC range are soluble tannins and yeast polysaccharides, and can really help with adding mouthfeel and making a more complete wine much sooner to market. But we'd want to rack off the gross lees at this time, and then we would want to basically inoculate with our select strain of malolactic bacteria. And then within our range, we also have a malolactic bacteria nutrient, Osmobacti, which will help ensure the successful implementation and proliferation of malolactic bacteria. These poor little guys have to deal with a very barren, nutrient deficient environment. So anything that we can do to facilitate their success will help, especially if they are dealing with very high alcohol levels or low pH. So that's definitely a tool available to winemakers and something I highly recommend, as well as temperature fluctuation and control. After, we would want to rack off the heavy lees again, making sure that if there's any sort of off aroma, to remove completely the whole lees if there's any sort of issue. And luckily, we have different types of yeast derivatives like Surly 1 that we could apply to supplement lees as well and help expedite the autolysis and release of quality yeast polysaccharides like manner proteins into wine, which will help add to mouthfeel and also the preservation of wine. So during malolactic fermentation, we want to stir about once a week. And then at the end of malolactic fermentation, it's very important that we add SO2, as that will help preserve the specific aromas and the diacetyl level, depending on how much diacetyl we would like. And we would want to rack 24 hours later, and make sure to have storage until bottling be at 55 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. For malolactic fermentation in barrel, it's a little bit of a different process, as we're going to want to keep the wine between 60 and 65 degrees Fahrenheit. At the end of alcoholic fermentation, which would be at Brix dryness, we'd want to top the barrels completely and then inoculate with our select strain of malolactic bacteria, depending on the style that we're looking to go after. And with that, we could also examine the health of the lees, and if the lees are stinky, or we feel like they're unhealthy, or there's been any sort of microbial spoilage or botrytis or any sort of disease pressure from the fruit, we definitely want to make sure to rack off the lees. And this would be a very vital and important time to apply yeast manner proteins from a clean product like Surly 1. And during that time, we would want to, practice batonnage during malolactic fermentation, stirring once a week, and then once complete, SO2, rack off the lees 2 to 3 days later, and then return to barrel for aging on the light lees. So here I have listed some of the winemaking protocols for the specific styles that we outlined specifically for more of a classic California Chardonnay with a higher level of diacetyl and for barrel fermentations, and then as well as a protocol for increasing minerality and succinic acid. I don't have as much time to go over this in detail with you guys, but I really went over the basic principles in this webinar and wanted to give you a good foundation for really understanding the steps and the different products that go into each of these specific protocols. And with that being said, if you guys have any questions, you can reach out to me and I'm happy to go in more detail about the specific protocols, and they're all available in the supporting documents for you guys to review, hopefully after this presentation. And I'm really excited to hear about any of you who are using the protocols and what you think and what the resulting wines are. So please keep in touch if you end up implementing any of these during the 2020 vintage. Here I have again also the Chardonnay strain characteristics for what we recommend within our range with the Q Citrus, Aroma White, Vintage White, ES 181, and then we also have a few other strains which can be supplemented in there, like the Q9 and the Perlage. I have all of the characteristics here just as a reference for you guys to look through again. And then it's also very important to reference some of the enzymatic activity that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. And if you guys have any sort of questions or want any feedback from my experience with our yeast range and the various trials that I've done, please feel free to reach out to me as well directly, and I'm happy to kind of share some more data with you guys. And with that being said, thank you so much for your attention, and I am looking forward to the Q&A, and thanks again for your time. Here we have the citations as well for your reference. And if any of you guys have any questions about anything else that was cited in this, please feel free to reach out to me.